Hello, and welcome to part 4 of our notes on the integumentary system. This is our last section of notes for this unit, and in this one we're going to deal with injuries and how they heal. And fair warning, there will be some images that might be disturbing to you, so I recommend that young viewers who are not taking my class don't watch this video. And I will, when I get to those images, I will let you know before I pop them up. So if you don't want to see them and just want to listen, you can just close your eyes and then I'll tell you when you can open them up again. Um, but when we get to the third and fourth degree burn stuff, it's disturbing. It's not pleasant. So I will let you know when we get to that point. All right, let's begin. So injury and skin repair. How fast and effective healing happens depends a lot on the wound. Obviously, a slender little clean cut, you can hold that back together with a bandage and it'll heal pretty quick. A big jagged cut or tear, it's harder to get the skin back the way it was. It's going to take longer to cut. Or if you get a big scrape or abrasion, it's going to take even longer to heal because the healing has to happen from the outer edges and come in. Um, and bleeding occurs when the injury extends into the dermis. Remember, you can damage your epidermis. There's no blood vessels in there. Okay, you'll be fine. So we do that all the time. It's sacrificial. That's part of the point of it. But if we get down to, if you see blood, then you know you've gotten into the dermis, and that's going to trigger a healing response. So first step in a cut. So let's just orient ourselves here. We've got the stratum corneum, stratum basal or stratum germinapium come along here, just above the papillary layer of the dermis. This is all dermis, and then we got hypodermis down here. And we can see we got bleeding occurring and coming into the wound, starting to fill the wound up. That's going to trigger the inflammatory response. And we'll talk more about inflammatory response stuff when we get into the lymph and immune system. Step 2, after several hours, it's filled up with blood, which is coagulated and scabbed over. You can see here that the stratum germinapium is starting to, instead of just proliferating upward like it normally does, create new layers of the epidermis, it's going to start proliferating sideways and moving down into the cut to try to wall off the dermis back here. So you can see it's working its way down on this side, and this side's not all the way underneath yet. And in the scab, in the wound area, your blood has brought in a whole bunch of macrophages, white blood cells and things like that, that are there to eat and destroy foreign bodies and materials in there, hopefully, bacteria and viruses to keep them from giving you an infection. They're also there, what they will do is they will start eating away at the blood clot to make room for your skin to grow back in. You also got some fibroblasts in here, which are going to start to create some of the elastin and collagen fiber that make up the dermis to try to knit the two sides of the wounds back together to kind of hold them together. All right. About a week later in this picture, we can see that the stratum germinapium has undermined the cut completely and has actually started to proliferate upwards as well to create new epidermis. The fibroblasts have started to knit things back in here really well. And we're well on our way to healing this wound. Not completely healed yet, obviously, but we're well on our way. Phagocytic activity, those cells that are eating the dead debris, is almost done at this point, and the clot is starting to disintegrate. A little bit later, a couple weeks later, pretty much healed, right? We've got a full epidermis over the top again. Underneath, we've got these fibroblasts still creating fiber, scar tissue if the cut's bad enough, and this is going to continue to work. Now, right away, you got a depression, and sometimes that'll stick around. Some of us have scars that are depressions because our fibroblasts didn't produce enough dermis underneath to get it back up to even. Sometimes these will go crazy and make more than you need, and you get the bump for the scar. I've got a few of those myself. I don't think they're going to show up on camera. So those ones are there, and that's normal for your body. When your body experiences trauma or difficulty, it usually responds by building back stronger if it can. So it's going to put more collagen and more elastin in those areas and try to make that skin a little bit tougher there, because now your body says, hey, this is a part that might get damaged. We better make it tougher than it was before. We'll talk about that more in a few other units as well. There's a law named for that in the skeletal system called Wolff's Law. Just a little bit of foreshadowing for you. All right, so that's healing a cut. Okay. Let's talk about first aid for cuts. I'm not going to ask a ton of questions about first aid, guys, but I do think you should know this stuff. And most of and here's the site I got it from. If you want to look for it. So apply direct pressure on the wound or cut, clean cloth or piece of gauze until the bleeding stops. So if you've got a piece of gauze like this, that would be ideal, or a clean cloth. And universal precautions I should mention if we're going to talk about this. That would include some sort of eye protection and gloves and washing your hands ahead of time if you're able to. These days, it would also include a mask. Before you start treating the wound, I mean, if it's a crazy emergency and you just got to get right in there to save a life, then you got to get right in there and save a life if you don't have all the proper stuff. But then you make sure you wash your hands and stuff right away afterwards, and you're going to see the doctor so you can get tested for stuff. If the wound is on the arm or the leg and you can raise it up above the heart, that's ideal because that's going to reduce the blood pressure. So there'll be a little less blood loss up there. The hand washing glove thing I already talked about. Tourniquets. Those are tricky. I wouldn't apply a tourniquet unless the bleeding is so severe and there's no way you're going to stop it and there's no way they're going to make it to professional medical help. It's a last ditch thing, because when you put on a tourniquet, and I've got one in my trauma kit here, when you put on a tourniquet, guys, you are literally squeezing down around the limb so tight that you're closing off the major arteries supplying that limb with blood, which means if it's on there too long, you may lose the limb, right? Because you've cut off that blood supply for too long. Kind of like, bed sores, just a little bit of skin, but you tourniquet a whole arm, bang, that arm could be gone if it's on there too long. So if you have to put a tourniquet on, be prepared to that person may lose that arm or leg. But if it's a choice between the arm or the leg and death, I think most people, I know I would prefer to lose the arm and leg and still be alive. And there's a whole bunch of stuff about using a tourniquet, which I'm not going to get into because this isn't a first aid course, and I'm not certified to teach it, but just some background stuff for you guys. After you've stopped the bleeding, how do you do it? Gently clean the wound, a little soap and warm water, rinse it out, apply, a little antibiotic cream to the infection, some disinfectant to keep it from getting infected, and then put a bandage on it, keep it clean and dry. Pretty basic stuff. If it's a really severe one, obviously you're going to the doctor. They might do stitches, and they'll tell you how to care for the wound. When to call a doctor if you've got a cut like after the fact, right? Or right away. If the wound is deep and the edges are jagged and gaping open, you're probably going to need stitches. So go into the doctor. If it's on the face, anything more than just a very minor cut, anything on the face, it's harder to heal, and we don't want to mess with it because your face is always moving as you're talking and blinking and things. So anything major at all on the face, just go to the doctor and have them take a look at it and make sure you're good to go. You don't want to get infection here. If the wound has dirt debris that you can't get out, you got to go to the doctor and they'll debris it. They'll take care of get all that stuff out of there. If the wound shows signs of infection, it's red, it's inflamed, it's warm to the touch, it's producing pus, or if the person starts developing a fever after the wound, if they get a fever, that means the infection that was in the wound has now traveled and become systemic in their whole body. You definitely need to get to a doctor then, because that can be bad. An example of what that might look like here is some blood poisoning. This red streak coming out from the wound, that is indicative of blood poisoning. Get thee to a doctor now. Puncture wounds. A little bit different with puncture wounds. Normally with a wound, you want to stop the bleeding right away. With a puncture wound, unless it's like spurting blood, like you're in an artery, puncture wounds, you actually, not a bad idea to let them bleed for a little bit for a small puncture wound, because you can't get in there and clean that wound out well. So the bleeding is actually your body flushing out the wound with blood. Obviously, you don't want to lose too much blood, but a little bit of bleeding to help flush out any dirt, debris, bacteria, viruses that got into the wound is probably good. Then stop the bleeding, disinfect it, figure out the tetanus shot situation. If they haven't had one recently, then they need to go in and get one, because you don't want to mess with tetanus. It'll lock up your muscles and it's no good. All right. That's it for like cut kind of stuff. let's take a look at burns. There are three common degrees of burns. There's actually a fourth degree, which is really nasty. We're going to mainly focus on the three: first, second, and third degree. And I always got this mixed up when I was younger. I didn't know if first degree was like, you're first, that's the worst, that kind of thing, or if it was the best. First degree is the best to have. If you're going to have a burn, you want first degree. Second degree, kind of the middle. Third degree, don't want it. Okay? You don't want to get the third degree. That is the worst of these three types of burns. First degree burn only affects the epidermis, just that very top layer of skin. So the first degree affects the first layer. And we've all had this, just, run of the mill, touch a hot pan or sunburn are generally first degree burns. And so we know the wound gets red, a little bit of swelling, a bit of pain, which is no fun, but no real lasting damage or harm. Okay, it'll heal pretty quick because you damage the first layer, so the stratum germinaceum that reproduces quickly, it'll replace that skin pretty quick, and then you're good to go. So here we got hypodermis, dermis, epidermis. There's the papillary layer, right? So it's just the epidermis is damaged. That's first degree. So you see redness and swelling. Here we got a different view. Here's muscle, hypodermis, dermis, and you can see the burn has only damaged the epidermis up here on top. One layer, 1 degree. Heals pretty quick and easy. Second degree burns. This is when you get the dermis, epidermis, and the top part of the dermis damaged. So second degree, down into the second layer. Symptoms are very similar to a first degree burn, but then you add in blisters. If you've ever had a burn that blistered, like a bad sunburn or touching something hot, and you got blisters from it, that was a second degree burn. So here we can see, here's the dermis, here's the epidermis, and that dermis and the epidermis essentially pull apart, just like a friction blister. When you rub something long, and it kind of pulls the epidermis away from the dermis, this burn damages that connection, and they separate, and then it fills with that fluid, and that's a blister. So if it blisters, that means you've gotten into the second layer because you've damaged that connection between the epidermis and dermis, and it's going to fill with fluid. So we can see we've got blisters over here, epidermis down into the dermis, and we got that blister fluid in there. Before I go to a third degree burn, should you pop the blister? Go back to the blister picture. Should you pop that? Not if you can help it. This blister right here, guys, you still have epidermis over the top. It's still keeping out the bacteria and the viruses and other debris, and it's keeping fluid from leaking out of your body, keeping you from getting dehydrated. So that blister, you want to leave it intact as long as possible. Now, if you're, say, hiking back, into the woods and you're 2 days away from help and you get a blister on your foot from a friction blister or something like that, and it's going to pop as you're hiking the next day, then maybe you'd want to pop it in a controlled situation where you can pop it with something that you sterilize, and then you can bandage it and disinfect it properly, so it doesn't happen like randomly, halfway through your hike and then you don't stop and realize it and it gets infected. That would be a different situation, but in normal circumstances, you do not want to pop a blister. Leave it intact. It offers some protection to the wound. So the next image is of a second degree burn. Somebody who I believe spilled coffee on their lap. It's not terrible, but just to let you know, this is what we're looking at here. So we can see redness, swelling, and some blistering going on in various places here, which tells us it is a second degree burn. Third degree burns. Getting nasty now. The entire thickness of the skin is damaged. The epidermis, the dermis, and we're down into the hypodermis even, into that fat layer underneath the dermis. The burned area will appear gray or white, ashy kind of, cherry red or black, all sorts of different colors depending on how it got burned. There is no initial edema, swelling, or pain. There's no swelling because you don't have any skin to hold the swelling in. It just, all that fluid weeps out. and you don't have pain in the middle of the wound because you burned away the nerve endings. You're going to have excruciating pain around the edges of the wound where those nerve endings are still intact or severely damaged but not burned away. So it is not pleasant. And here we can see one. We're through the epidermis, the dermis, into the hypodermis. And this one, technically, it looks like they're showing the muscle be burned a little bit there. So it might be bordering on 4th degree, which is getting into the material underneath the hypodermis. So here we can see just an image, a drawn image of it. We can see it. You might get some blistering around the edges where it was just 2nd degree, but all the way through the dermis and into the hypodermis, into the fat. This picture is somebody's hand with a 3rd degree burn. And before I show it to you, I'll just describe it so you can decide if you want to look at it. Have you ever cooked like a Polish sausage on the grill? And it gets a little overdone, and it gets the casing gets charred, and it cracks open, and then fat bubbles out, and then you get a flame up in the grill from that because you cooked a little fast. And so you get that cracked, charred, fat bubbling Polish sausage. That's kind of what this hand looks like. The fire got in, whatever burned them, I don't know what it was, burned the skin, charred it black. It split like the Polish sausage, and you can actually see the fat underneath, and that fat may have ignited. It's not unusual for that to happen depending on how it burned in a 3rd degree. So you can actually melt it and start burning it like a candle, which is not good. But here it is, 3, 2, 1. There it is. So we can see the black charring, the gray, the split skin, and we can see the fat, the hypodermis underneath there. So it's pretty gross. So keep your eyes closed, guys. I'm going to go on to the next one. It's really small right now, but I'm going to blow it up in a minute. This is somebody I believe was in a car accident where the car caught fire. One interesting thing, I guess, to note is that they had on some boots that actually protected their feet from getting severely burned, but their legs did not escape. So I'm not going to leave this one up very long. So keep your eyes closed. I'm going to make it bigger. So you can see how it's black, red, gray, split. We can see, we can actually see the muscle, though it doesn't look like the muscle burned. And you can see where their boots or shoes here protected their feet. Lots of swelling. Moving on. This next image is a 4th degree burn. I'm not sure how this one occurred, but this one we did get through and into some of the muscle. So you probably don't want to look at this if you're at all squeamish about these other ones, but 3, 2, 1. We can see here, I got into that stuff. All right, open your eyes. We're done looking at the gross stuff. All right, so just to reiterate on the burns, the epidermis, if that's the only part that's damaged, it's 1st degree. If you get into the 2nd layer of the dermis with the burn, it's 2nd degree, and you get blisters. If you get into the 3rd layer, the hypodermis, then you start to get charring, red, black, gray, split skin, sometimes no pain in the middle of the wound where it's worse because you burned away the nerves. But if it's into the 3rd layer, it's 3rd degree. So let's take a look at something called the rule of 9s, and I don't expect you guys to memorize this, or I'm not going to test you on it. It's just something interesting for this. So that's the way they estimate the severity burns. If you watch on the news, if somebody got burned badly, they'll say, they'll talk about burn over 90% of their body or something like that. How do they determine that? Burns are considered critical if over a quarter of the body has 2nd degree burns, so blisters on over a quarter of your body, because that's a lot of damage to your body's largest organ, your skin. And it's going to take a lot of energy to heal that much tissue. So it's going to be putting your body through a lot of strain trying to heal that. Okay. If over 10% of the body has 3rd degree burns, because that damage is so severe and it's all the way through the epidermis, all the way through the dermis, so it's going to take a long time to try to grow back in. Because at least with a 2nd degree burn, you can grow from underneath it. You still got some dermis under. So you still got some dermis underneath there that can grow up. 3rd degree, there's nothing underneath it. Everything's got to migrate in from the sides and down and then up. So it's going to take a lot longer, a lot more energy, and you've completely lost all the function of the skin in that area. It's no longer keeping out infections. It's no longer holding in moisture. So infection and dehydration and keeping them from getting hypothermia, all big things that the skin helps to do, is a big issue when dealing with these more severe or critical burns, particularly the third-degree ones, if they're very large at all. Infection, dehydration, and hypothermia are all issues that can arise because you lose so much of the functionality of the skin, and it's such a large organ. It takes a long time to heal. If the third-degree burns are on the face, the hands, or the feet, because those things are always moving, they're harder to get healed. We want them to heal well and not have too much scar tissue, because that can affect functioning later on. So those are considered critical. And then as far as percentages here, interesting thing with the surface area of the body, the front of the arm is 4.5%, and the whole arm would be 9% of your surface area. Your front of your head is 4.5%, and the whole head would be 9% of your body area. The front of each leg is 9%, so each leg in total, 18%. The front of your torso is 18%, so the whole thing, 36%. And then the perineum or the genital area is about 1%. So we can break the body's surface area up and estimate how much of the body was burned based on this rule of nines, which is kind of cool. So let's talk first aid for burns. For basic, first, second degree burns, first thing to do is cool the burn. Hold it under cool, not cold, cool. Running water for 10 or 15 minutes until the pain subsides. I don't know if anybody cooks, but if you ever, talk about like you take a roast out of the oven or a turkey out for Thanksgiving, right? You're supposed to let it rest for a while, and the temperature will continue to rise in the center of the bird or the roast for, 10, 20 minutes. So you let it rest for a bit and come up to that final temperature you want. Same thing can happen to your skin with a burn. So that's why you want to cool it off and keep cooling it off. Not just a quick, 30 seconds in the water, but for a significant amount of time if you want to minimize the damage and stop the damage from getting worse. When it's all done, cover the burn with a sterile bandage or sterile gauze, but don't use a fluffy cotton one. Oh, I did that once. I was at a wedding. I can't remember if it was Rachel or Logan. I think it was Rachel, was a baby. And so my wife was at the table talking to somebody. So I was walking through the buffet line to get food. I had the baby in one arm and a plate in this hand, and I was scooping stuff up. And it was kind of like here, wall behind me, table in front of me, but narrower, and people on either side of me. And the plate, some of the gravy, I just put some gravy on the potatoes that I got, and the gravy dribbled off the plate and onto my wrist right here. Gravy was boiling hot, and I couldn't do anything about it. I had baby in hand, plates, people on both sides. It stayed there for a long time before I could get it all off. So it just kept burning and burning. And I got one of the worst burns I've ever had. Not the worst. I've had worse ones with doing my blacksmithing. But this one, it created a blister that was like that high. It looked like a tennis ball blew up on the side of my wrist. And I covered it with gauze, sterile gauze. I didn't get the non-stick sterile gauze. And when that blister burst, pulling that thing away, oh, that hurt like heck. So sterile, but not fluffy. Okay. And then take a pain reliever, like ibuprofen to help reduce swelling. If you have a major burn, call 911 and wait for help. If it's like burned clothing kind of situation, don't remove it because you might be tearing away skin and things like that. However, obviously make sure that they're not still in contact with burning materials. If that's the case, obviously get rid of it. But if the fire is out, don't try to pull that off. Don't immerse large severe burns in cold water. It could cause hypothermia and cause them to go into shock. The whole CPR thing, check all that. Elevate the burn body part, helps reduce blood flow to that area so they don't bleed out and lose too much moisture. Cover the burn with a cool, moist, sterile bandage or moist cloth towels. You don't want dry because it'll stick, but you don't want soaking wet because you don't want to make them go into hypothermia either. Don't put ice directly in a burn. It's too cold. It can actually freeze the skin and cause further damage. Don't use those old wives' tale things like egg whites or butter or ointments on a burn like that. That could cause infection. Let the doctors take care of it. And like I said before, don't break the blisters because it is providing protection. You still have an intact epidermal layer over the top, And as long as you can keep that, it gives more time for things to heal underneath before the blister breaks. Blister breaks and exposes you to infection. All right, and that will do it for the notes on skin and the integumentary system. I hope you learned a few things, maybe some things to help you help somebody else if they're get a burn or a cut sometime. And we will see you in class later. Have a good one.